Yeah, the question has to do with the stabilization fund. The stabilization fund was similar to funds that were set up in other countries, oil companies, countries in particular, the Chinese had something similar. This was a fund that was built up, and it was, I think at one point, well, about $600, $700 million, $1 billion, not million, $1 billion, that was used for a variety of purposes. First of all that money in it, that pushed up the value of the ruble. You don't want it to go up too high, because the higher the value of the ruble goes, the more difficult it is for the Russians to develop a manufacturing sector to be exported. In other words, that's complicated economics. If the ruble is strong, because you've got lots of money coming in, that means that goods that you want to import from Russia, priced in rubles, are very expensive. And so you'll go elsewhere. You go to China, you go to India, where the dollar will go further than if you have to buy very expensive things in Russia. So the stabilization fund is in part to help Russia, just because they were used to not having money on the side, but the stabilization fund can boost the ruble, make the ruble strong, and also for a time they were using it to make investments outside the country as well. Because you've got this money and you can now do things outside that you were not able to do before. So, and it gives you a sense of security. Well, we don't have to worry about a run on the ruble or a run on the stock market. We've got all this money set aside for, it's basically a rainy day fund in that sense. So it stabilizes the currency, it stabilizes the country, and you can use it if you find it necessary to make investments outside or do other things. But at this point, it's just kind of a sign of Russia has recovered from that 1998 period when they had almost no money in the treasury. So it's kind of a symbol of recovery. That's responsible. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Somebody must have had an extraordinary vision in '98 to go from zip to $70 a keg of oil to $100.
147.
And my question to you is, I mean, it doesn't, oil is in the ground, and
Yeah.
it just doesn't come up by itself.
Yeah.
And there must have been a plethora of pipes that were built around the country. Who had the vision to do that?
Well, you know, the price of oil, of course, is, you know, until recently we didn't think Russia was playing much of a role in this. We thought it was Saudi Arabia and OPEC. Russia is not formally a member of OPEC. It's kind of it sits in, and when OPEC cuts back, Russia usually increases its production because oil prices are going up, and they can be the beneficiaries of OPEC's discipline and cutback. So who sees that? Who was aware of that? Well, first of all, the Russians have really nothing else going for them. In terms, if you look at their export profile, there's almost no manufactured goods. And they were exporting non-ferrous metals. They're a big producer of non-ferrous metals, but it was really oil. So they were doing oil. They were doing back oil even in the 1970s. So you go back earlier. So they now what has happened, of course, is it wasn't the government that was doing it, because when these things were privatized in the 90s, you had individual oligarchs who took over control of these companies. Some of the people who became oligarchs had been officials in the Ministry of the Petroleum Industry. They just simply now owned it instead of managing it on behalf of the government. So they were all, you know, they were moving all independently with the idea that even if oil prices were down, they wanted to be able to be in a position to expand production. And then when oil prices, for whatever reason, went up, partly because of cutbacks of OPEC, partly because of, you know, continually increasing demand from consumers, they were the beneficiaries, and so they became very wealthy. And these guys, I really talk about the different owners in the book extensively, one after another, and some of them have investments in this country. Some of them have partnerships with American oil companies. Almost every American oil company has some operation going on in Russia, because it's a big country and that's where the reserves are. And as our reserves are depleted, is it worse dealing with OPEC or with the Russians? I mean, both cases, so you just want to diversify your bets this way. So why did the price go up? Well, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes, usually because of a crisis, or a political crisis, or if some pipeline blows up. Every time a pipeline blows up, there's great concern this way. Yes, ma'am.
We were in Russia, in Moscow and Petersburg in May, and I had the sense, came away with the sense that many of the CEO positions and people who were opening banks for companies and so on, really in their 20s, late 20s, early mid-30s. Now, how are they going to react to the general, the former KGB, and their kids taking over in the oil industry? Is there going to be some tension between the generations amongst the different?
Yeah, is there tension between, one of the question is, she was there and noticed that there were a lot of young people in charge. There are a lot of young people in charge. It's one of the, because there are people my age sitting on it. It's because there was no private operation until recently. So this has been a great opportunity for young people, many of whom, of course, went to the Harvard Business School. I spoke to the Harvard Club of Moscow. That's something to do. All these young guys, because they came when there was a vacuum, and they could move in and they could take over these companies. So there was a great opportunity for them. Whereas there weren't, their seniors, their parents were not there to hold them down. So how are they going to react? Well, so far they're reacting, great opportunity, and they see Russia's rich in raw materials, and they're having a great time, and they're living it up, and making sure their children, their sons and daughters go to Harvard Business School as well. You want to, the Harvard Club of the Russian Club of the Harvard Business School. That's a fascinating thing. You see them when they see them here, and then you see them over there. Spoken to both groups, and it's fun to watch. Yes, sir.
Your figures make quite clear how dependent Europe has become on oil and gas from Russia. How about China? Is China getting more and more dependent on oil and gas from Russia? What are the implications of that?
Yeah, this is something my wife and I mess around with all the time. Pipelines are now being built from Russia into China. The Chinese are not dumb, and they recognize the danger of becoming too dependent for natural gas. But oil coming through, and of course oil is coming out of Sakhalin, an island in the Pacific above Japan. The fields are being developed there, oil fields are being developed there, and that could supply oil again. And it's fungible. You cut off one source, you can go someplace else. The Chinese are eager to get the natural gas, and they're bringing it down, from Russia all the way down to Shanghai. The Chinese have a very serious need for natural gas because of the pollution problem is so bad. I mean, to the extent that natural gas is doesn't mess up the air as coal does in China. But if you've ever been in China, it's ghastly. That's a pun, but it's because of the coal. The coal is just kind of, if you see them, it's bituminous coal, which means it's soft coal, and it's kind of packed together in little wafers, and they burn them in their house, and it's these little furnaces, little outdoor cookers, and it's just dreadful, particularly in the winter. I mean, you can just taste it this way. And if you go to industrial cities, it's even worse. And the Chinese have had serious problems with lead poisoning, as if you're listening to NPR, there's a whole series of things about lead poisoning, and also from the sulfur. So the Chinese are very eager to have these natural gas pipelines coming from China all the way to Shanghai, which is a long haul. But the Chinese are also aware, I say, of the political implications, and so they're working with Kazakhstan. They're working with Kazakhstan to build similar connecting, so that if the Russians cut out, they hope that they can substitute it with gas from Kazakhstan. But again, it's a long hike from the border in the north all the way to Shanghai. It's again, it's a very important political tool for the Russians to have, and the Chinese are trying to make sure they don't become too dependent, but they don't have many alternatives. I mean, where else do they go? They're trying to develop. The Chinese are trying to develop fields offshore, in the Pacific outside, and they've had some luck. They found some petroleum, particularly Shanghai and the Yangtze River. Also, they found some there, but not enough to make them completely independent. They still are very heavily dependent on the Russians, which is a major source of supply. Yeah, back here.
When Moscow went to Tbilisi a year ago, was that, in your view, largely about breakaway republics, or was it about, and if not, how much of it was about Caspian oil and gas?
Well, first the Russians and the Georgians and the Azerbaijan and Armenia generally, they never, they hate each other. So and Saakashvili, the president of Russia, did everything he could to stick it in his fingers in the Russian face. And so it had to do with control of the Caspian, it had to do with Saakashvili, it had to do with all kinds of things, oil and gas, just an entire basket of things. What was what? I think the Russians said, let's soccer to it, basically. We'll teach them. And the Russians, have to worry. They're worried that their former republics can be too independent, and they are nervous about having too much control. So it's the fighting that was going on there. We talked a lot about this last meeting we had with the Russians about what went on in Georgia, being very critical of the Russians. Their attitude is, well, they got what they deserve. I'm sorry.
Khrushchev just recognized the independent states of Georgia.
Yeah. Well, also, they're breakaway. They're Abkhazia and Ossetia, and those people are crazy too. I mean, we used to hear about Abkhazia. Used those ads, people who live to be 100 years old. Yogurt, you drink the yogurt, eat the yogurt, and you would eat it. So the Abkhazians have been very independent, and the Ossetians are been fighting all the way along it. So the Russians are doing everything they can to strip Georgia of what Georgia thought was part of its territory, and the Ossetians don't like the Georgians. They don't like the Russians either, but they dislike the Georgians more. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, you were talking about the contracts with China, and Gazprom has been signing more and more contracts with Europe as well. Gazprom hasn't been investing very much in new fields and new production, and at some point they basically can't, probably sometime in the next 5 or 6 years, they can't fulfill their production. Do you see any sign that they know how to get out of that?
The question is, Gazprom is signing contract after contract to promise to supply gas, and the question is, will they have enough gas to honor their contracts, to fulfill their contracts? That's something that's being discussed quite a bit. The Russians feel that they can continue to find new reserves. Russia's a big country. They're going more to the north. The technology allows them to do more. And to some extent, they're beneficiaries of earth warming, because they can get access to areas that before would just be very difficult to operate. But they also maybe have flooding as a consequence, because as the ice cap melts, that inundates some of their areas. This last visit, we went up to Yakutia, which is a source of some of their production. And at this point, they feel very confident about it. It'll be interesting to see if they can find enough new fields to offset the fact that the existing fields are being depleted. This is a good opportunity here for American firms, because Americans have technology that will extract a larger percentage of the reserves than what the Russians can do. The Russians have been very sloppy about this, not been able to do it. And so one time we went up, we were up in Khanty-Mansisk, which is again up in the northern part of Siberia. What do we find there? We find operators there from Conoco. They're operating. I mean, I have technology, and you want to hire me, hire me. And so you find Western oil companies, American oil companies in particular, going up there, using their technology to help them dig deeper, and now to the extent that the Russians are doing that. That should extend the lifetime of some of these reserves, but they can't be too ambitious and indeed sign too much. And they're also very wasteful in how they handle their reserves. But the higher the prices, the more likely it is that they'll be thinking more seriously about what they have to be less wasteful. Yes.
Well, thank you. What is the reason for the recent rise in inflation in Russia while the whole world is going through a deflationary cycle, including the United States, and how does this affect the oil industry in Russia?
Yeah, where does the inflation in Russia come from? Budget expenditures, not enough production, not enough of other goods. So the money comes in, the money was coming in from oil operations, and the government was printing money, and there was not enough substance there to absorb it. So that's why that's why I say Putin has his hands full. Medvedev has his hands full too with the fact that the general level of inflation is taking place. Then it's a serious concern. Of course, we'll have to see what happens in the future. And they're aware of the problem. They don't. Again, it's interesting because they have had so little experience. They've had some experience, but relatively little in dealing with the kind of macroeconomic problems that we've been dealing with for not only decades, but in some cases centuries. So they're not quite sure, how to use monetary policy to control things. But it's a learning experience, and they're learning while doing so. Yes. Did you have one? Let me go back. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was in Russia 2 weeks ago for the nanotechnology forum opened by President Medvedev, and so that this Ross Nano is one of the state corporations, and they kind of have a schizophrenic relationship. They get criticized one day and then praised the next day. I was wondering if you could. Well, basically, they're looking at nanotechnology and other science technology as a way to diversify their economy. They know they're too dependent on oil and gas. Any comments on these state corporations and one?
Well, the Russians are looking, Putin is looking at recognizing that too much reliance on the raw material sector, as I said before, is not healthy. So what they kind of leapfrog, say, well, what's in the future? And one of the things they see in the future is nanotechnology, dealing with very small things. And so they've created a nanotechnology company run by by a former KGB general, assuming that will be useful for them. But it's unclear how successful it's going to be. But that's again let's do nanotechnology, so we'll be a step ahead of the rest of the world. So it'll be interesting to see if they can apply the kind of resources to it that they would do with they were doing Sputnik and other space activities. So far, we don't know. There has been very little evidence of that, but some of their best people have been assigned to do this kind of thing. So, yes, ma'am?
What is the nature of the relationship between the Russians and the Arab producers?
What's the relationship between, say, OPEC, the OPEC members, the Arab producers? It's hot and cold. There are times when they cooperate together, and there are times when the Russians say, good, cut back production, that's great for us, we'll increase it. So it's, the Russians have tried to take the best of both worlds by encouraging OPEC, encouraging the Arab countries. The Arabs don't really need much in the way of Russian technology there. That's just not useful for them. So it's been, for the most part, a cooperative thing until the Russians begin to undercut too much, and then the OPEC generally, not just theirs, but OPEC generally say, hey, you're screwing it up for us here, and you should be more cooperative.
But you don't see any risk of them colluding to make trouble for the rest of the world?
Well, there was a time, yeah, they were pushing up the price in '73. They were cooperating together. Let's push up the price. Let's make it while we can. The Russians are not, they don't have the attitude, well, if OPEC is bad. On the contrary, but that doesn't mean that they're going to march in lockstep with what OPEC does. OPEC so far for them has been quite beneficial because they end up being the beneficiaries. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the question about diversification of the economy. You talked about new technology, but that can only be a small part of the total economy. So what about green energy technology and stuff like that? I mean, the Chinese have been investing tremendously in alternative energy sources and stuff. And for the Russians themselves, they have to fuel in the future, right? And the Russians might be concerned about that as well. How will they ensure that they have enough of energy production in the future that is not...
the question is, what are the Russians doing towards green energy? I must confess, I try to look, I don't find very much. I mean, it's very hard for them because they've got so much oil and gas. Let's use it now, and I'll let my grandchildren worry about it in the future. So there's not much incentive at this point, and the government hasn't done very much. I've seen very little use of green energy there, even solar. Of course, they're far north, so solar is not such a great idea to begin with, because in the winter, that's usually very what sun there is, you don't see very often. I mean, being there.
What about nuclear? Pardon? Nuclear?
Well, the nuclear, the Russians, were very active in nuclear, but they've been burned by that too. Chernobyl and all the rest. But the Russians were, at one point, were going to be one of the world's leading producers of nuclear energy. And Chernobyl set that back quite a bit. But at one point, they thought it was something they could do and do very well, and they were going to be exporting reactors. That was going to be a big business, like not the nanotechnology thing, but that was going to be something that they could do. And then Chernobyl cut all that off.
But what are they investing in then? I mean, they have to diversify the economy.
They're investing in their oil and gas.
Only?
Well, not only, but so far, because they've got so much of it, it's just the easy thing to do. Why should we strain ourselves when it's here? And I don't mean to say the Russians are peculiar that way. I mean, most of us don't think too much about our third or fourth generation down the line in terms of energy. So they do like most of us do. Let's burn it up now and worry about it later. So I just don't see very much. There's talk about it, but not very much going on in terms of actual activity of either nuclear or solar or biofuels. I mean, I may have missed it, but I just don't see it.
It sounds as though they're not too concerned with global warming.
Well, for Russians, global warming is not something to worry about. Bring it on. I mean, because what it's done is it's already opened, the northern route on the Arctic Sea. So the Russians are, they say who says global warming is bad? Energy's less, winters are less severe. Already, that's a problem. When we went out to Yakutia in Siberia, they took us into this cave, to see this snow maiden sitting on an ice cube, which was rather bizarre. But they're worried because it's melting. The permafrost is melting. And that could set off flooding, that could set off a variety of things, but I mean, for people, just winters aren't as cold. I mean, so they have mixed emotions. The people who are worried about flooding are worried about it, but so far, I don't see doing very much to try to prevent it. I mean, people don't go, in my experience, don't go around saying, don't do this because it'll increase earth warming. Just don't say that.
Given Medvedev's background, he's a businessman,
Right.
and he was connected with Gazprom, maybe still is. Do you think, I mean, isn't it a little strange that he was being such a wimp, or do you think he's working behind the scenes in a much more effective way? And by the way, I was wondering if he knew about your book and what was his reaction to the title?
Well, Putin knows about the book.
Yes. Medvedev.
Yeah, Medvedev, I don't know if he knows about it, but Medvedev is a wimp. I mean, that's, his parents are academics. Both parents. So by, he's brought up in a, kind of parents are intellectuals. Both mother and father, whereas, of course, Putin's parents were tough. Hard scrabble. They grew up in a communal apartment, which was not the best way living in a. When I say what a communal apartment is, it means you take one apartment with 3 or 4 rooms, and you put 3 or 4 families in that, so they share the toilets and they share the kitchen, and that's not a it's a tense environment, and so you can tougher. Whereas Medvedev didn't have to experience that. His mother's an academic and his father's an academic, and I just think he's softer.
Have you seen the difference in his body language
Yeah.
in recent months?
Yeah.
Yeah.
First it was
Well, and,
it was Olympish, and now it's more confident.
Well, what we were looking for were we see if we could generate tensions or find tensions between Putin and Medvedev. So far, this last series of meetings, it was either Medvedev or Putin. I forgot which, and I have to go look at my notes. So, you're trying to see if there's a split between us. There's not, and so far there are only very small traces of it. But Medvedev is more law and order type, rule of law, whereas Putin has been the law. What I say is that's what's going to happen. I would be very surprised, let me put it that way, if we don't see growing tensions between the two of them. And there's also a question of who's going to run the next time around. The terms have been extended from 4 years to 6 years, but there are term limits, and will Putin run again? Will he run against Medvedev?
Yeah.
And that, that's, stay tuned. That's why the story is such an interesting one. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. It's hard to believe that there won't be tension. So, maybe one more question? Yes.
Well, I just,
Ma'am, sorry.
where does the power lie between the two at the moment? How
Where
would
does
you
the power lie?
assess it?
Right, as far as I'm concerned right now, the power lies with Putin. Because it's not just that Putin is strong, but it's also because if you look at this list, the people underneath are Putin's people. And it's going to take a while for Medvedev to bring his people in where he can rely on them and let them take over. But for now, these guys owe their loyalty, their allegiance to Putin, and if Putin says something, I would be surprised if they move in a different direction. Sure. Well, I think that's it.